Right now, in a small kitchen somewhere in the countryside, a woman is heating her entire home for pennies. No gas bill, no electric heater, no firewood truck showing up at her door. Just two things sitting in her kitchen cabinet right now: charcoal and salt. That's it. And what she does with them keeps her house warm for hours, sometimes days, without spending a single extra dollar on energy. Sounds impossible, right? Stay with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this old trick is quietly making a comeback all over the world. Before we go further, if you're someone who likes learning practical money-saving ideas like this, hit that subscribe button right now. It's free, and it means you won't miss the next video where we break down another hidden trick like this one. Now, let's get into it. Winter energy bills have become one of the biggest financial headaches for families everywhere. Every year, the price to heat a home creeps higher, and every year, people are forced to make hard choices. Do you keep the heater on a little longer, or do you put on another sweater and hope you don't freeze? For a lot of families, this isn't a small decision. It's a monthly stress that builds up quietly in the background of daily life. And that stress is exactly why this old-fashioned method has started spreading again, from grandmothers who never stopped using it to young families discovering it for the very first time. So what exactly is this method? At its core, it's incredibly simple. You take charcoal, the same kind used for grilling or heating, and you combine it with ordinary salt. When set up the right way, this combination creates a slow, steady release of heat, not a wildfire, not something dangerous or explosive. Just a controlled, gentle warmth that can last far longer than a regular fire alone. People who've used this method for years describe it the same way. It's not about burning more, it's about burning smarter. Think about how most people heat a room today. They flip a switch, and a heater roars to life, pulling electricity like there's no tomorrow. Or they crank up the gas furnace, and within weeks the bill arrives looking like a small monthly rent payment. Both of these methods burn through energy fast, and both of them cost money every single time you use them. The charcoal and salt method works completely differently. Once it's set up properly, it holds and radiates heat slowly, which means you're not constantly feeding it fuel like you would with a regular fire. It sits there quietly, doing its job hour after hour. Here's where it gets interesting. Salt has a unique property. It changes the way heat is retained and released. Anyone who has ever used a heating pad filled with salt or ice knows this feeling. You warm it up once, and it holds that heat for a surprisingly long time. Now imagine that same principle, but paired with the slow, steady burn of charcoal. The salt acts almost like a heat reservoir, soaking in warmth and letting it out gradually instead of all at once. That's the secret behind why this combination lasts so much longer than people expect. What makes this even more interesting is how forgotten this method became. Decades ago, before modern heating systems took over every household, people relied on exactly this kind of practical knowledge. Grandparents and great-grandparents didn't have the luxury of central heating systems humming in the background of their homes. They had to be resourceful. They had to understand how materials around them behaved, how heat moved, and how to make the most out of very little. Somewhere along the way, as modern conveniences took over, a lot of this knowledge simply faded into the background. Nobody needed it anymore, so nobody talked about it. But something has changed recently. As bills climb higher and higher, more people are quietly turning back to these forgotten methods. Not because they're old-fashioned or nostalgic, but because they actually work, and because they don't require a single extra dollar spent on gas or electricity. It's become less about tradition and more about necessity. Now you might be wondering, how does something so simple actually create real, noticeable heat? It comes down to basic combustion and chemistry working together in a very deliberate way. Charcoal, when it burns, releases heat steadily rather than in a sudden burst. It doesn't flare up and die out quickly like paper or dry leaves. It smolders, it holds, and it keeps producing warmth over an extended period. Salt, when introduced properly into this setup, interacts with that heat in a way that slows down how quickly it escapes into the air. Instead of warmth rushing out and disappearing in minutes, it lingers. It spreads more evenly. It stays. This is why people who use this method often describe the warmth as different from a regular fire. A regular fire feels intense up close, but the heat fades fast once you step away, or once the flames die down. This method feels different. It's more even, more consistent. The kind of warmth that fills a small room and stays there, rather than a blast of heat that disappears the moment the fire stops. Of course, at this point, you're probably wondering exactly how to set this up. What ratio of charcoal to salt? What container to use? How to light it safely? How long it actually lasts in real conditions? And most importantly, whether this is something you could realistically use in your own home this winter. All of that is coming. But first, it's important to understand why this method has been sitting quietly out of sight for so long, and why almost nobody talks about it anymore, even though it clearly still works. Part of the reason comes down to convenience culture. Once gas heaters and electric systems became widely available, older, more hands-on methods started to feel unnecessary. Why deal with charcoal and salt when you can just flip a switch? But convenience came at a price, literally. Every flip of that switch adds to a bill that keeps climbing every single year. The trade-off for comfort became a trade-off for money, and a lot of families are only now starting to feel just how heavy that trade-off has become. There's also the fact that this method requires a little bit of know-how. It's not as simple as pressing a button. You need to understand proportions, safety, ventilation, and timing. And in a world that constantly pushes instant solutions, anything requiring a bit of preparation tends to get pushed aside, even if it works better in the long run. But once you understand the setup, and once you see how long the heat actually lasts, you start to realize why so many households never stopped using it, generation after generation. So here's what's coming next. We're going to walk through exactly how this method is put together, the small details that make the biggest difference, the mistakes beginners often make when trying this for the first time, and the exact way to get the most heat out of the least material. Because it's not just about knowing that charcoal and salt work together, it's about knowing how to use them properly so you actually get warmth that lasts, without wasting anything, and without putting anyone at risk. Let's pick up right where we left off. You now understand the basic idea. Charcoal burns slow and steady. Salt holds onto that heat and releases it gradually. Together they create a kind of warmth that outlasts a normal fire by a wide margin. But understanding the idea is one thing. Understanding how it actually comes together in a real home is something else entirely. So let's slow down and walk through this piece by piece because the details matter more than most people realize. The first thing to understand is the container. You can't just pile charcoal and salt on the floor and expect magic to happen. People who use this method rely on something simple, usually a metal container or a clay pot, something that can handle heat safely without cracking or catching fire itself. Metal buckets, old cooking pots, even certain fireproof clay vessels have been used for generations. The container isn't just a holder. It plays a role in how the heat spreads and how safely the whole setup functions. A good container contains the burn, directs the warmth outward, and protects the surrounding area from any direct contact with the charcoal itself. Next comes the layering. This is where a lot of people get it wrong when they first try this. It's not about dumping charcoal and salt together in one messy pile. There's a method to it. Charcoal typically goes at the base, arranged so air can move through it properly. Fire needs airflow to burn evenly, and charcoal is no different. Then, salt is added around and sometimes lightly over the charcoal, not smothering it, but surrounding it in a way that lets the salt slowly absorb and hold onto the rising heat. This layering is what allows the slow release effect to actually happen. Get the layering wrong, and you either get a fire that burns out too fast, or one that struggles to stay lit at all. Now here's something a lot of people don't expect. The heat doesn't peak dramatically like a bonfire. It builds gradually. In the first few minutes, it might feel unimpressive, almost like nothing is happening. This is exactly where beginners often give up, thinking the method doesn't work. But this is the nature of a slow burn. It's not designed to blast you with instant heat. It's designed to build steadily and then hold that warmth in the surrounding air for a long stretch of time. Patience is part of the process. The people who've used this for years know that the real payoff comes later, not in the first 5 minutes. Once the fire is properly established and the salt begins absorbing that steady stream of heat, the room starts to feel different. Not overwhelming, not smoky, just a soft, consistent warmth that spreads evenly rather than concentrating in one hot spot. This is one of the biggest differences between this method and a typical space heater. Ventilation is something that has to be addressed clearly. Burning charcoal indoors without proper airflow can be dangerous because it produces carbon monoxide, a gas you cannot see or smell, but one that can be extremely harmful in an enclosed space. This is why people who use this method traditionally never use it in a fully sealed room. A cracked window, a vent, some form of airflow, these aren't optional extras. They're necessary parts of doing this safely. Anyone thinking about trying this needs to treat ventilation as a non-negotiable step, not an afterthought. Timing is another piece of the puzzle. Depending on how much charcoal and salt are used, and depending on the size of the container, this setup can hold heat anywhere from several hours to, in some cases, well over a day, especially when maintained and topped up correctly. This is drastically different from a regular fire, which needs constant feeding and attention to keep going. The slow burn nature of charcoal combined with the heat-holding property of salt means less maintenance, less fuel, and a lot less effort compared to constantly restocking a fireplace or running an electric heater around the clock. This is exactly why, in areas where energy costs have become brutal, and in situations where people are looking for backup heating options, this old method keeps resurfacing. It's not marketed. It's not sold in stores as a product. It's passed down, shared quietly, rediscovered by people who stumble onto it out of necessity rather than curiosity. And once someone tries it and sees how long the warmth actually lasts, they tend to keep doing it, winter after winter. There's also a financial side to this that's hard to ignore. Charcoal, especially in bulk, tends to be inexpensive compared to running electric heaters for hours every single day. Salt is even cheaper, often something already sitting in a kitchen cabinet. When you compare the ongoing cost of flipping on a heater every night for months versus a low-cost, slow-burning setup that requires far less fuel overall, the difference becomes obvious pretty quickly. This isn't about replacing modern heating entirely. It's about having a reliable, low-cost backup that doesn't leave you completely dependent on rising energy prices. Something else worth mentioning is how this method connects people back to a kind of resourcefulness that's been slowly disappearing. There's a noticeable shift happening right now, with more people wanting to understand how things actually work, rather than blindly depending on systems they can't control or predict. Knowing how to create consistent heat with two simple, affordable materials gives people a sense of control that a monthly utility bill simply doesn't offer. It's not just about staying warm, it's about not feeling completely at the mercy of prices that seem to rise no matter what. At this point, you might be thinking about trying this yourself, maybe as a backup option, maybe as your main way of dealing with cold nights without watching your bill spike. But there are still a few critical details left to cover, the kind of details that separate someone who tries this once and gives up from someone who uses this method successfully all winter long. What ratio actually works best? What common mistakes ruin the whole setup? And what most people overlook when trying to make this heat last as long as physically possible. All right, let's bring this all together now. By this point, you understand the concept, you understand the setup, and you understand why this method has quietly stuck around for generations, while modern heating systems keep getting more expensive every year. Now, let's talk about the details that actually make the difference between a setup that barely works and one that keeps a room warm for hours without you having to think about it again. The ratio matters more than people expect. Too much salt, and it can smother the burn, choking off the airflow the charcoal needs to stay lit. Too little, and you lose the slow release effect that makes this method special in the first place. Most people who've used this successfully describe a simple approach. Start with a solid base layer of charcoal, enough to establish a steady burn, then surround it with a generous layer of salt, without fully burying the charcoal itself. The goal is balance. The charcoal needs to breathe. The salt needs enough direct exposure to the rising heat to start absorbing it properly. It's less about precise measurements, and more about observing how your specific setup behaves and adjusting from there. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is impatience. They light the charcoal, wait 5 or 10 minutes, feel underwhelmed, and assume the whole thing is a myth. But, as we talked about earlier, this isn't a method built for instant results. It's built for sustained results. The real payoff shows up later, when the salt has fully absorbed heat and starts radiating it back out steadily. Give it time. Let it build. The difference between giving up too early and letting the process complete itself is the difference between thinking this doesn't work and realizing it works better than almost anything else you've tried. Another common mistake is ignoring airflow entirely. Some people, in an effort to trap heat, seal off every possible gap in the room, thinking this will make it warmer faster. This isn't just ineffective, it's genuinely risky. Burning charcoal always requires proper ventilation, no exceptions. A cracked window or a small vent isn't going to significantly cool the room, but it will keep the air safe to breathe. Anyone serious about using this method needs to treat safety as the foundation, not an inconvenience standing in the way of maximum warmth. People also tend to underestimate how reusable and low-cost this setup really is over time. Once you understand the right balance, and once you have a proper container set up, the ongoing cost is remarkably small. Charcoal can often be bought in bulk for very little, and salt is one of the cheapest, most widely available materials there is. Compare that to running an electric heater for 6 or 8 hours every night for an entire winter, and the financial gap becomes obvious almost immediately. This isn't about abandoning modern heating altogether. It's about having a dependable, low-cost option that doesn't leave your comfort completely tied to how high energy prices climb this year. What's fascinating is how something this simple managed to fall out of everyday knowledge for so long. It wasn't replaced because it stopped working. It was replaced because convenience took priority, and once something becomes unnecessary in daily life, it quietly fades from memory, generation after generation, until almost nobody remembers it anymore. But necessity has a way of bringing old knowledge back to the surface. As bills climb and people look for real, practical ways to cut costs without sacrificing comfort, methods like this one are being rediscovered, tested, and shared again. Not because they're trendy, but because they genuinely work. There's something powerful about realizing that real solutions don't always come from new technology or expensive upgrades. Sometimes they come from simple materials that have been sitting quietly in kitchens and sheds for decades, waiting to be understood properly again. Charcoal and salt aren't flashy. They don't come with an app or a warranty or a sleek design, but they work consistently, affordably, and reliably, which is exactly why this method has survived long enough to reach you today. If you've made it this far, you now know something that a lot of people don't. You understand not just what this method is, but why it works, how to set it up safely, and how to avoid the mistakes that trip up most beginners. That's real practical knowledge, the kind that can genuinely make a difference this winter, especially if rising costs have been putting pressure on your household the way they have for so many others. Now here's where you come in. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, something worth trying, or even something worth telling a family member who's been struggling with high heating bills, don't just scroll past it. Drop a comment right now and let me know if you're planning to try this method yourself, or if you've actually heard of it before from a parent or grandparent. I genuinely want to know how many of you already knew about this, because I have a feeling this is more common in certain families than people realize. Your comments help this channel grow, and they help me understand exactly what you want to see more of. And if you know someone, a parent, a grandparent, a friend who's been complaining about their heating bill lately, share this video with them directly. Send it in a message, post it in a family group chat, whatever works. This is exactly the kind of information that helps people save real money, and it costs you nothing to pass it along. Sharing this video might genuinely help someone lower their bills this winter, and that's a pretty simple, powerful thing to be part of. Before you go, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because this channel is all about practical, real-world knowledge that saves you money and gives you more control over your daily expenses. There's a lot more coming, methods, tricks, and forgotten knowledge that used to be common sense but somehow got lost along the way. If this video helped you see things a little differently, the next one probably will too. Thank you for sticking around until the end. Stay warm, stay smart, and I'll see you in the next video.